back then I could never visualize what is out there now. I mean, I drove by there probably a year ago, and a lot of those new homes.
What was going through your head? Do you remember?
Oh, yeah, it was just like it was like a surreal moment.
Yeah.
I mean, because I just remembered how it was back then, and I think of the movie Rocky, and when before he becomes famous, he's jogging through the neighborhood, and there's 55-gallon drums on fire. Guys are keeping warm. That was the kind of atmosphere on the block back then. Yeah.
You heard that there. That's former South Bend police officer Sam Walsh describing what the 1200 block of West Washington Street, better known as the Block, used to look like and how different it is now. More of that later, but first, welcome to Round the Bend Now and Then, a podcast that shines a light on the South Bend and Mishawaka areas past and present. Through interviews with local business owners, leaders, and community members, our listeners and I learn together about all of the great people and great things going on in our community, as we also learn about South Bend and Mishawaka's history and how intertwined our past is with our present. I've always been so intrigued by the 1200 block of West Washington Street in South Bend. It's located just west of the Oliver Mansion and the Tippecanoe Place. In short, it went from a thriving neighborhood and business district to basically a skid row, a dumping ground, abandoned buildings, drugs, killings, prostitutes, gambling, to now a calm residential street that, other than a few storefronts and buildings that survived, you would have no clue what used to stand there. It is a fantastic success story of revitalization that our city and the Heritage Foundation should forever be applauded for. A brief history of the area that would eventually be nicknamed the Block. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, the area near the intersection of Washington and Walnut Street, like many in South Bend, was inhabited by immigrants who moved here for work in the local industry. By the 1950s, Washington and Walnut was basically a thriving, self-contained district, a city within a city, a melting pot of ethnicities, with Polish, Hungarian, and African-American-owned residences, grocery stores, doctors, pharmacies, furniture stores, churches, and so forth. A true, thriving, diverse neighborhood. But in the 1950s and 60s, like other older areas of our inner city, urban decay set in. I met with Joe Molnar recently, and he is an expert in our area's population shifts and changes in neighborhoods. And in the coming weeks, you'll hear way more about how and why changes occurred to neighborhoods like West Washington. By the 1970s, the 1200 block of West Washington Street, the Block, as it had now been nicknamed, was one of the most crime-riddled areas the city of South Bend has ever seen. Actually, right now in our city, thankfully, there isn't a street or area that even compares to how bad this was. And now, I'm not naive. Obviously, I understand that we still have issues to work on, but it was nothing compared to this. I found over 100 different South Bend Tribune articles just from this little area. Full, and I'm not lying, full of stories of gambling, crime, stabbings, prostitution, battles over what to do with the decaying area, citizens writing into the newspaper demanding the city do something. Throughout the 80s and early 90s, the city, and specifically the Heritage Foundation, passionately fought to acquire properties and ultimately revitalize the 1200 block of West Washington into a nice residential area. I'd love to do a future episode just on the revitalization piece because there is so much history here. But today, what you'll hear are stories from the Block, from a few different angles. You'll hear from a law enforcement angle, from Sam Walsh, former South Bend police officer who patrolled the Block in the early 70s and then worked undercover on the Block. Now, folks my age and older will definitely know Sam from the Crime Stoppers programming commercials. Side note, the story behind Sam launching Crime Stoppers in South Bend in the early 80s is so intriguing that there will be another episode dedicated solely to that. Another angle from which you'll hear about the Block is from Jim Bankowski, Retired now, but longtime principal in South Bend. His grandparents and then parents owned longtime bar and restaurant Nyikos, which was located on the southwest corner of Washington and Walnut. Literally, in the center of all the action that occurred over the years on the block. Jim shares his memories of the area as a kid in the late 50s and early 60s, and then as an adult, helping to run the bar and restaurant. To paint a picture of what the area of West Washington and Walnut Streets used to be like, how it was literally a city within a city, and how it had everything you needed right there, Jim shares some of his earliest memories of the area with the different businesses up and down Washington Street. And he also fondly remembers time spent with his grandmother. Talk to me about your earliest memories about just the area.
Well, when I was a kid, when I was really young, it was, it had changed a lot.
Okay.
And became the street, the block over, just east of them, became the block.
The block.
The block, yeah. But when I was a kid, it was still a pretty thriving neighborhood. Lots of Hungarian and Polish people. Lots of the businesses. Actually, it was an area that you didn't really have to go other than for clothing. You didn't really have to leave the neighborhood for anything.
All right,
because there were grocery stores, drugstore, paint store. St. Vincent de Paul had a store there. Wow. There were bakeries. There were bars. There was a diner, the old G&H diner, which is.
There was a White House.
There was a White House
on
diner
West Washington.
On West Washington.
Really?
There was a bowling alley that was owned by my great uncle.
Okay.
And then my granddad and grandmother took over the tavern, the bar in there. But my uncle kept the bowling alley and kept running it. So I remember as a very young child being in that bowling alley.
Right.
And I remember walking that neighborhood, going maybe with my grandmother once they closed the tavern, or stopped the food service because she cooked there. We would go walk down to the G&H to have lunch. Or if she was looking for furniture or something, she'd head down the street a little bit further to Sandok's furniture store.
Okay.
And it was just
amazing.
There was a fruit market.
It's just
and
crazy.
That sold Christmas trees in the wintertime, which we had several of them from there, across the street from Sandok's. And it was.
It intrigues the hell out of me that, our city had just cities within cities.
Right.
Is what that was.
Right.
And it just intrigues me that there's still remnants of it around our city now. You still see Western Avenue. You still see, River Park is businesses and
it was
Miami.
It was kind of like a River Park area, actually.
Yeah. Okay.
A little bit further down there was a funeral home. Konyeski Funeral Home was there.
Okay.
The original Konyeski. And then the natatorium was next to that. And across from that was the children's dispensary.
Yes, still standing.
Yes.
Notre Dame.
The building, yes.
Yes.
But and there were churches all over the area. God. And they were all within walking distance. And on Sundays, my granddad would drop my grandmother and me off at church, and we would walk back to the tavern afterwards. And he was usually doing his book work, and then we'd go across the street to the grocery store, and she would buy the meat that she would cook for us at her house. It was
all right there.
Oh, all right in the same. And she'd stop at the drugstore next door, and she'd pick up whatever toiletry items and so on for the house that she needed, or any prescriptions and so on. It was Art for Hostra's Rexall Pharmacy.
If you ever get the chance, you should walk up and down the 1200 block of West Washington Street now. It is very hard to imagine that all of this hustle and bustle used to be right there. To further paint a picture of how connected the neighborhood was to West Washington Street, Jim lists the numerous doctors that serve the neighborhood.
They even had lots of doctors in the area. above the grocery store that was across the street from my dad's tavern, and above the drugstore was Dr. Miller, who was a dentist.
Okay.
Dr. Grayson was a podiatrist. Around the corner from the loan company, a little bit further down the street, was Dr. Butts, who was just a general doctor. A little bit further down on Washington Street was Dr. Toothaker, who was a dentist.
Okay, go figure.
Yeah, and I mean, you didn't have to.
That's crazy.
You were right there.
Just amazing.
And my grandmother would go to Dr. Miller, and she went to Dr. Grayson, and these were all prominent African American doctors.
Right.
And they were upstairs. You had to walk up this long flight of stairs to get to their offices, but they were and
wow. It's just so different than what we're used to now.
Yeah.
As I mentioned in the intro, by the 1960s, the neighborhood was experiencing changes. More and more folks had access to the automobile, and no longer was it necessary to have all of your shopping needs within a mile of your home. The demographics of the neighborhood shifted as the families of the Hungarian and Polish immigrants moved out. More African American families moved into the neighborhood. And as the years progressed into the late 1960s, like many inner cities across the country, racial tensions rose. Next, you'll hear a bit about something that I guarantee every South Bend resident that was alive in July of 1967 remembers: the race riots. To read the Tribune articles from the time, it truly paints a picture of how awful it was. And the 1200 block of West Washington was just one of two areas in the city that riots and major property damage took place. The riots occurred there at Washington and Walnut, and also the area near Western and Walnut, where those old storefronts are now, near the train viaduct. And it was bad. Multiple fire bombings, hundreds of police officers called from the area, Mayor Allen warning parents to not let their kids out after dark, fire trucks severely damaged from the vandalism, dozens and dozens of injuries and arrests. To show how wild it was, I'll read this from an article. Quote, "Most of the stone throwing occurred at the intersection of Washington and Walnut, where youths set up barricades to halt unsuspecting motorists who were stoned after they were forced to stop. Windows smashed in the Washington drugstore and merchandise was stolen. A firebomb was tossed at Nyikos Bar, 1302 West Washington. No fire damage was reported, but windows were also smashed." Next, Jim talks about just that, the scary time at Nyikos during the race riots.
Well, neighborhood started changing in the 60s. And I remember the riot of, I think it was 1968.
Yep.
My dad was, he actually
Talk to me about that. That was what I was going to talk about.
Spent 3 nights there in the tavern.
Your dad or your grandfather?
My dad owned it at that time. So my dad ended up he slept on the pool table for 3 nights because people broke out the windows, and then he had to have them boarded up the next day, and then they ended up with gates across, across
bars.
the windows, and
man.
But that was a bad time. That was a bad time.
It was bad. There were articles in the Tribune from a month after the riots with business owners on Western Avenue in West Washington talking about the financial impact that the riots had on their businesses. From August 20th, 1967, the manager of Sandok's Furniture Store, which stood at 1217 West Washington Street, quote, "People will not venture into this area after dark, and that is when most of the furniture is sold because you can bring the whole family there. Even in the daytime, people have a funny feeling coming into a store with its windows all boarded up. But what can you do? If we take the boards off, the windows will just get broken again." Next, you'll meet Sam Walsh. As I mentioned in the intro, he was a longtime South Bend police officer who worked the beat on the block, a few short years after the riots. So when he started in 1970, the block was definitely hot. Next, he talks about why he wanted to work the block as a rookie, beat number 40.
Well, they had the riots in 1967.
Yeah.
And Sandok's Furniture, that store was torched.
Yep.
And that was, the block was just, I was a rookie in 1970.
Okay.
And I wanted to work the block so bad.
You wanted to. That was one of my questions was, how'd you start? So.
Yeah. So basically, back then, before take-home cars, we had the high crime areas had two-man cars.
Okay.
And so the block was two-man, Keezy was two-man. And so I just, from day one, as soon as I hit the street, I wanted to work the block, yeah. That's where the action was.
Yeah, that's why you wanted to work
Oh, absolutely, man. I was out of the Marine Corps.
Yeah.
And I was gung-ho, and I worked 15's beat, which is down around Scottsdale Mall.
Yes.
And I got so bored with getting shoplifters. The mall opened, I think, in 73.
I was going to say the mall had to have been brand new.
Oh, man. So anyway, when we got out to the block, I was fired up.
And one of my questions was like, what were your thoughts when you were assigned there? But your thoughts were you wanted to be there.
Oh, yeah. To me, that was the ultimate beat.
Okay.
40 was a beat. 40, we had different zones, and 40 was Washington Walnut.
Next, I asked Sam what he thinks about when he thinks of the block during that era. And his answer pretty much paints a picture of what that area was like. And you'll also find out why a city safety director called the Washington and Walnut area a literal dump and a landfill. And he challenged the mayor to visit and help do something about it. Mm-hmm.
And, I think of the movie Rocky, and when before he becomes famous, he's jogging through the neighborhood, and there's 55-gallon drums on fire. Guys are, keeping warm. That was the kind of atmosphere on the block back then, yeah.
That's crazy. In one of the articles I read, there was I wrote it down here, a gentleman, he was the safety director. His name was Michael Carrington.
Yeah. I like the good guy.
Really? So you knew him?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. For him. I worked for him, yeah.
Okay. It was March 30th, 1975. So it was towards the end of your beat when you were...
Yeah, because I started working undercover in the summer of 75.
Okay. So at this time. But anyway, the article was titled Ghetto Condition Disclosed. And the safety director, Michael Carrington, challenged Mayor Jerry Miller to come out and spend some time here. But he also gave a councilman a 3-hour tour of that area. And literally, he's like, this is a dump. This is a mini dump. And there's pictures in the newspaper. It's black and white, but the view on the corner of Washington and Walnut shows debris and concrete slabs pushed on the sidewalk. Another one says unofficial landfill. There's like washers and dryers.
Oh, yeah.
That's wild.
Yeah. People that lived outside that area, say down around Twickenham Hills and whatnot. Of course, back then there wasn't Granger.
True.
But they could never imagine what the block was like.
I found another article from 1970, and when asked about how nasty and trash-riddled the area was, city engineer Lloyd Taylor said that Washington and Walnut just received a thorough cleaning and trash pickup. Cost the city $5,000. Today, that's $39,000. That's quite the cleanup, in my opinion. Just shows how dirty it was. Again, you drive up and down the area now, and it's just hard to imagine it looked like that. Next, I asked Sam what were the different types of crimes that he was faced with on the block. What, in your years on the block on West Washington, what are the different types of crimes that you were just faced with?
Probably robberies.
Okay.
Person to person.
Yeah.
Lot of dope deals.
Okay.
That would go bad. Fights.
Yeah.
Typically, robberies probably were the most part of it.
Okay. Yep.
Where there'd either be a person-on-person robbery, or somebody gets sidetracked thinking there's some prostitutes going on there.
Yep.
And bingo! All of a sudden, there's a mark for us. So
that's funny you said that about that, because all the newspaper articles that I saved, I was reviewing them the other day, and there are several of guys who got robbed who were waiting for a prostitute.
Yeah. And then some of the stories they would tell their wives, would get back to us. Yeah, I got lost, sweetheart, and all of a sudden these police officers were dragging me out of the car.
I was on West Washington and Walnut in the 1200 block. Like, honey, we live in Granger.
Yeah, exactly.
That's funny. Well, it wasn't funny for them, but now looking back, it's funny. Sam and I continued talking about the different types of crimes that he dealt with while patrolling the block. And then we got into him going undercover trying to bust heroin operations. Next, you'll hear a few different tales.
There was a Dominiac Plumbing.
Mm-hmm.
There was a building, and then there was a vacant lot where a building used to be, but it burned down. Then there was Bunk and Bees. Okay. And so there was a big heroin operation at Bunk and Bees.
Okay.
So the owner of the plumbing company gave us the abandoned second floor
to survey.
And so we took video cameras up, and there was plywood was over the window, so we cut a hole in the plywood. We spent a month there, collecting intelligence and whatnot. Then we finally served a search warrant on Bunk and Bees, and within a week that building was arson.
Within a week, the building that you had been staking them out was arson.
Yeah. So the word got out. There must have been in the affidavit on the search warrant. How the methods that you guys used to do that. That's amazing. That's bold. Oh yeah,
that's bold.
But that was the block.
That was the block. Next, you'll hear about a close call that Sam had while working undercover trying to buy heroin at the Bunk and Bees. Man, did you have any close calls? Any scary moments over there?
Yeah, I was working undercover, and back then we did hand-to-hand buys. So we would have.
So you did. So you walked straight up to him, and
oh yeah, I got a picture on my phone. I had a big afro and a beard.
Yeah.
And so I developed an informant.
Okay.
And he was buying heroin from this guy at Bunk and Bees.
Okay.
And Bunk and Bees had it was kind of a restaurant. It had a counter and whatnot.
Okay.
And then the gambling took place in the back. And so it was a white guy. The informant was a white guy.
Yeah.
He takes me there to introduce me to the drug dealer. And the drug dealer told him to tell me to wait out front, which I did.
Okay.
And so I was just sitting there minding my own business, and I was wearing a wire. And so I had surveillance guys out about a block away.
Yeah.
So they're listening to the conversation. And so the informant comes back, and I see I see him talking to the dope dealer in the back.
Yeah.
And so they do their thing, and the dope dealer doesn't want to.
You don't want to sell you anything.
Doesn't want to meet me or sell me anything.
Yeah.
So the informant and I leave. We get in my car, and he goes, "Man, did you see him holding that shotgun on you?" And I said, "No, I didn't. If I did, I probably would have freaked out."
Damn right.
I mean, okay, you got two decisions. You either be cool, or you pull your gun and start firing, putting rounds down range.
Right.
So I was in a precarious situation without knowing I was in a precarious situation.
Right. Which is almost better.
Yeah,
you didn't know it. And now, a brief message from me to you, my listeners. Folks, I need your help in spreading the good word about Round the Bend Now and Then with your friends and family who you think would enjoy it. I obviously want to grow the show and increase our listeners, but I also want to be sure that we share the good things that we learn about the people that I interview and their businesses, their organizations, books, etc. To share, all you have to do is copy the show's website, paste it in a text, and hit send to a friend. Or just tell them to Google Round the Bend Now and Then, and it's right there. Tell them that we're on all of the popular podcast apps like Apple, Spotify, Amazon, and so forth. And while you're at it, tell them to download, like, or subscribe to the show on whatever podcast app that they're using. And if they're feeling especially squirrely, tell them to leave a review on why they love Round the Bend Now and Then. I thank you in advance for helping to spread the good word. And now, back to our episode. We spend the next several minutes talking about a place called Little Johnny's Cigar Store and its owner, John Brinson. Little Johnny's was located at 1240 West Washington, right near the Walnut intersection, and across from Jim's grandparents' bar, Nyikos. Now, I had never heard of Little Johnny's until I started researching for this episode, and what I found was the name Little Johnny all over their Tribune articles from the 1960s through the 1980s. Then I met with Jim, and he brought up Little Johnny's as well. It's well worth our time to share a few stories surrounding Little Johnny's Cigar Store on the block. Next, Jim talks about how the policy was ran out of Little Johnny's Cigar Store.
Next to the Grosseteria, next to the 24-hour was Little Johnny's.
Okay.
And I believe it was Little Johnny's cigar store. In the cigar store, there was more than just cigars being sold.
As our listeners right now, he's doing the quotation marks with his fingers.
Yeah, but the back of the cigar store, there was gambling.
Absolutely.
And the policy was run out of that.
Wow.
That was like an early form of
the lottery, right? Yeah.
And the policy man used to come into my dad's tavern.
Oh, hell.
And see my grandmother. And my grandmother would give him some money. And then, and he was honest as could be because he'd bring her winnings if she picked the three numbers that they drew that day. And she'd make a few bucks on that, but she had her policy, man.
Yeah, that is awesome.
Yeah.
I could probably do an episode alone on John Brinson. If anyone knew him or knew about him and wants to chat, reach out to me. Just from the Tribune articles alone, it is clearly evident that a ton of drama swirled around Little Johnny in his cigar store. Even as early as 1958, before he was on West Washington, he had a place called John Brinson's Cigar Store at 319 North Birdsell Street, which actually looks just like a house. So maybe he ran a shop out of his house. Who knows? Anyway, a fire causing $3,500 in the pool hall combination cigar shop destroyed most of the rear of the building. And that's almost $37,000 today, so it definitely wasn't a small fire. In the early 1960s is when he must have moved to 1240 West Washington. Matter of fact, he owned 4 buildings along there, including one right next door, the S&J Lounge. Sadari and Johnny Lounge. Sadari being his wife. And I may be mispronouncing that. Next, I asked Sam about Little Johnny's, and wow, it seemed just like a place straight out of the movies. You had mentioned earlier some of the more infamous spots along West Washington. You had mentioned Bumble. What was it?
Bunk and Bees.
Bunk and Bees. But then you also mentioned Little Johnny's Cigar Store. Now, was Little Johnny a real dude?
Yeah.
That you know of?
Yeah. As a matter of fact, he lived in Topsfield, not Topsfield, in the upscale portion of Twickenham Hills.
Okay.
Van Gates from Gates Chevrolet, he built a house back there, and Little Johnny had a home down there. It was a beautiful home. So he made a lot of money gambling.
So Little Johnny owned Little Johnny's cigar store, and he lived in a more upper scale area.
Yeah, it was all white area. There were no minorities down there then. And when I found that out, went by his place, and it was on a cul-de-sac, and like Van Gates was a millionaire,
correct,
and he built a house down there.
His company still, Gates, Chevy, Gates, Toyota still going on. Yeah. So Little Johnny owned was it a cigar shop or a bar? Or what was it, a pool hall?
The name's a misnomer. In the front they had just a small amount of cigars and stuff like that. But the guy at the front, he was at the front door. He was a buzzer guy. So when gamblers came in, they'd hit the buzzer, and that would be the okay sign. Then he had another button that was for trouble. And we had a guy went in to rob him. It was like 0 degrees one winter day. He pulls a pair of pantyhose over his face to disguise himself. He has a gray park on, and he goes in, and he points his handgun at the buzzer guy, and the buzzer guy ducks down and picks up a gun and goes boom and shoots him, and he falls out the door and he's dead. By the time we get there, he had vomited into his that nylon mask. And he was basically, by the time we got there, he was pretty much frozen. Yes, I mean, it was not only bad guys going there, but good guys just trying to protect the racket,
Yeah. Wow. There was definitely more drama surrounding Little Johnny and his West Washington Street cigar shop. In 1971, this is crazy, robbers from Chicago stormed into Little Johnny's with machine guns and literally made 25 men and women strip naked, and they crammed them into a bathroom. They made off with $8,500 worth of cash and jewelry, and that's $63,000 today. Not chump change. They were caught a while later at a toll road roadblock, so they didn't make it far back to Chicago. Multiple times in the 1970s, there were raids, arrests, crimes surrounding Little Johnny's cigar store. He and his wife were arrested in 1977 for running a gambling racket. The FBI said at the time that, now I don't know if I believe this, $3 million a year was running through their store. Next, you'll hear that Little Johnny was not a bad dude and wanted what is best for the neighborhood.
And actually, and Little Johnny's, he was like the boss of the neighborhood. So I'll never forget the pastor of St. Stephen's, Father Horvath, telling us this. This is when I was playing the organ at Corpus Christi Church, and he was pastor. He was telling us that a story that when he was at St. Stephen's, the parishioners would naturally walk to church,
correct,
in the evenings and so on, and they were having some problems with robberies and so on the way home from church at night.
Which is St. Stephen's, not there anymore,
was
but
on the corner of Thomas and
5 blocks
Thomas
south
and McPherson,
something like that. So pretty close, walking distance.
Yeah. 4 blocks maybe. Anyway, and which we used to walk from St. Stephen's every Sunday.
Yeah,
but he called up Little Johnny, and he said he wanted a meeting with him.
Wow.
But he said that he would come to the bar. But he said when he gets there, because he always wore his Roman collar, when he gets there, he wants him to turn the lights out.
Okay.
So nobody will see a priest walk in the bar.
Absolutely.
And they walked him through the bar to a back room, and then he had a meeting with Little Johnny and told him the problems that were going on. They stopped. He took care of it.
Amazing. Those are the types of stories that I'm actually just looking for. Just real human beings, real people, real neighborhoods, real in the moment dealing with changes in the neighborhood. That priest probably realized things are changing and he did what he felt was best for his bar, and he kind of risky. Father, the neighborhood priest walking into that Little Johnny's. That's a neat story. That is cool. John Brinson passed away in 2000 at the age of 84. Next, you hear that even though there was all types of crime going on in the area, Jim's father's tavern, Nyikos, rarely had any issues, thanks to relationships with neighbors and a couple of German shepherds.
There was a house right behind the tavern off the parking lot. There was a parking lot in between the tavern and his house. And it was an apartment house. And it was a big white house with a big front porch. And there was a lady who had an apartment on the side, and she always used to sit at the door all summer. She had that door open and there was a screen door, and she sat there all summer and she watched. And she would call him up and let him know, Mr. Kelly, somebody's in your parking lot messing around with the cars, and then he'd go out there and take care of it. But he had at nighttime he had 2 German shepherds. and one of them was my dog, and that was she had to be tied up because she had a thin chain, but if she needed to, she could break it.
Wow.
But the other one
crazy.
ran around the bar, and she was trained very well. She stayed behind the bar. But they wouldn't let anybody come in and then even reach behind the bar or go behind the bar.
Wow.
But he really didn't. He like robberies or anything. No, but he really didn't. And he had really good lunch business. His evening business was mainly carry out from neighbors.
Okay,
and they all watched out for him. And when I took over as principal at Madison, that was my district, part of my district. So
absolutely,
if I had to talk to a parent or a grandparent,
and
they lived in that area, I would tell them,
"That's my dad who owned."
Yep, my dad owned that, and they all knew him. And I was in. I mean, I spent 16 years there. We were family.
Wow,
we were family because everybody knew Dad.
Yes.
The respect was unbelievable.
I actually ran across a Tribune article of when Jim's parents closed Nyikos in 1983. And Mr. Principal, Mr. Bankowski's picture is front and center in the article. Next, he explains how helping his parents could have gotten him in some hot water. And then I also found the article, and I think I don't know if you've shared it or somebody did, of when you guys closed.
Yes.
I
put that on.
Okay. Yep. So that looked familiar, and you're in it.
That was. Oh yeah, I'm in it.
1983.
I was principal at St. Anthony's at that time, and Dad was closing. That was the last week that they were serving food and so on. Although he stayed open a little bit longer than that, but that was the last weekend they were serving food, and they were packed.
Wow.
Every single day. Roger Parent was mayor. He came in one day with the group, and he gave my parents the key to the city.
Wow.
Yeah.
Really?
And it was, but I thought, you know what? I can't. It was just my mom and a helper, Kate, worked in the kitchen. And then my dad was the only person working out in the bar. I thought, I can't leave him there.
Right.
Alone. So I used to leave school, go and help him through the lunch hour. Then I'd go back to school. Well, little did I know it was going to be in the South Bend Tribune. And in the South Bend Tribune, they not only put my picture, but said their son, principal of St. Anthony's. And I thought, I'm going to hear about. Never heard a thing about it.
Throughout the 1980s and early 90s, city and community leaders went back and forth forever on the best way to revitalize the area. We won't spend too much time on that today, discussing the revitalization of the West Washington and Walnut area, because I do want to have an episode dedicated solely to that, because it is truly an against all odds success story. Now, when you drive up and down West Washington there in the 1200 block, where all the abandoned buildings, prostitutes, drugs, and gambling occurred, are residential houses there now, and it is hard to imagine what once stood there. Next, Sam talks about just that, how surreal it is to him. I'm just so intrigued by all of this, because right now it is family houses.
Yeah.
I mean, just nice family houses, that's crazy.
Yeah, back then I could never visualize what is out there now. I mean, I drove by there probably a year ago, and a lot of those new homes.
What was going through your head? Do you remember?
Oh, yeah, it was just like it was like a surreal moment.
Yeah,
because I just remembered how it was back then.
Next, Jim talks about the same thing, driving down West Washington after his family's bar was torn down,
and it sat there empty.
Just sat.
It sat empty, and then it was torn down.
Yeah,
and I'll never forget driving. I think I was at Madison driving.
Probably.
And I got to the corner of Washington and Walnut. I was lost.
Wow.
I literally, I had not been in I was literally lost. I didn't know. And I could see a home. I knew the person. It was a lady who used to help my mom. It was Kate's house. I could see her house from there, and I thought, okay, I know where I am now.
Wow. Because just from that's muscle memory, and that's literally your whole life.
But it was all the duplex homes that were, very nice, but
yeah,
it was
wow.
It was a really weird feeling.
I could imagine. Thank you for listening to another episode of Round the Bend Now and Then. Thank you to Jim Bankowski and Sam Walsh for coming on and sharing your memories of the block. I truly, truly appreciate your time. I also mentioned wanting to do an episode on the revitalization of the block. If you know of anyone who was involved with the transformation of the area in that era, please let me know. Thank you again for joining me as we learn more about South Bend and Mishawaka's Now and Then.